These days, you have to be a politician or an assassin or something to really be a superstar.
When The Doors released Strange Days on September 25th, 1967, it arrived barely 8 months after their debut album. Most bands would have been exhausted or directionless after a sudden explosion of fame, but The Doors were operating on pure creative momentum. They had just scored a #1 hit with Light My Fire. They were selling out clubs and theaters across the country, and they were quickly becoming one of the most controversial acts in American counterculture. Elektra Records president Jac Holzman later said that The Doors were writing so fast and so intensely that a second album was almost inevitable. What most people didn't know was that many of the tracks on Strange Days had already existed long before the debut even came out. Much of Strange Days was composed during the band's legendary early residency at the London Fog, and later at the Whiskey A Go-Go on the Sunset Strip. Songs like Moonlight Drive, Strange Days, Horse Latitudes, and Your Lost Little Girl had been part of their live set since 1966. Paul Rothchild, their producer, felt the debut album couldn't fit every strong track they had, so he urged the band to hold some for the next record. That meant Strange Days wasn't a rushed follow-up. It was the second half of a creative period that had already been brewing for years. By the summer of 1967, The Doors had access to something few rock bands had at the time: an 8-track recording machine at Sunset Sound. Most studios were still using 4-track equipment, but Sunset Sound had just installed an Ampex 8-track machine, and The Doors became one of the first rock groups to use it extensively. This gave Paul Rothchild engineer Bruce Botnick and the band freedom to layer instruments, experiment with tape effects, and create textures their first album couldn't capture. Botnick later said that this new technology made Strange Days a more cinematic record, and that the band wanted to paint with sound. Jim Morrison was shifting too. The sudden fame from Light My Fire had already put pressure on him. Friends and bandmates have said he immersed himself deeper in poetry, surrealism, and in the dark mythology he carried in his head. This is the era where Morrison's imagination drifted into the shadowy corners of American life. Alienation, urban decay, and the feeling that modern society was cracking under its own weight. While The Doors, 1967, flirted with darkness, Strange Days lived inside it. Ray Manzarek later said the album reflected the strange energy of the times, and that Morrison was acting as both participant and observer of the chaos sweeping the country. The opening title track, Strange Days, was born from Morrison's nighttime walks through Los Angeles, especially the Sunset Strip. He talked about feeling like the city had become disconnected from itself. Too fast, too crowded, too artificial. The psychedelic guitar effects used by Robbie Krieger and the swirling keyboards from Ray Manzarek were achieved through tape flamming, done manually by manipulating the tape reels. This was one of the earliest rock recordings to use the technique. Your Lost Little Girl was older than many fans realize. Morrison had written early versions of the lyrics in 1965 or 1966, and the band performed it at their earliest gigs. Its studio recording shows off Krieger's more melodic side, influenced by guitarists like Wes Montgomery and flamenco players rather than the louder rock styles dominating the era. Love Me 2 Times, which became one of the album's singles, grew out of Krieger's love for blues and Baroque music. According to Krieger, he combined a blues riff with a harpsichord-like feel that Ray Manzarek later matched by actually using a harpsichord in the studio. The song was banned on some radio stations for being sexually suggestive, but band members have said it was really about the pain of someone leaving for war, a subtle reference to the Vietnam era, though this meaning was never stated publicly at the time. Horse Latitudes remains one of the strangest and most debated tracks in the Doors catalog. Morrison wrote the poem as a teenager, inspired by reading about sailing ships that were forced to throw horses overboard during windless stretches. The band created the chaotic sound collage using random percussion, studio noises, and manipulated audio effects. Rothchild later said the band treated the studio like an instrument on this piece, and that Morrison's poem had always struck him as hauntingly visual. One of the album's most impressive technical achievements came from "People Are Strange." Morrison wrote the lyrics after a period of depression, telling friends he felt detached from everything around him. Krieger and Manzarek helped reshape the song into something theatrical, almost like a Brecht Weill cabaret piece. It was released as the album's first single and reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100. "My Eyes Have Seen You, and I Can't See Your Face in My Mind" were older live tracks refined over months of performing. But Moonlight Drive was the emotional core of the band's origin story. Morrison had famously recited the lyrics to Manzarek on the beach in Venice in 1965, which led them to form a band together. Though the song was considered for the debut album, Rothschild believed it needed more development. By the time they recorded it for Strange Days, the band added slide guitar, eerie organ textures, and a looser arrangement that gave it an otherworldly feel. The album closes with "When the Music's Over," one of the Doors' longest and most ambitious early compositions. They had been performing it live since 1966, often stretching it far beyond the studio length. The song's structure, quiet spoken passages, explosive crescendos, and Morrison's shamanic chanting became a blueprint for their future epics like "The End" and "Celebration of the Lizard." The line, "We want the world and we want it now," became one of Morrison's most famous onstage eruptions. "We want the world and we want it!" But what made the track even more significant was how much it revealed about the band's developing identity. Each member carved out a distinct role. Manzarek's hypnotic organ lines created a trance-like foundation. Krieger's guitar provided both tension and release, and Densmore's jazz-influenced drumming guided the song's unpredictable dynamics. Morrison used the quiet sections almost like spoken-word theater, weaving environmental themes, existential anxiety, and surreal imagery into a single, long-form performance. In concerts, the song became a ritual. Audiences knew something unpredictable could happen, and Morrison often treated it as a space to test boundaries, emotionally and artistically. "When the Music's Over" wasn't just a closing track. It was the Doors, announcing that their music was as much about atmosphere and philosophy as it was about rock and roll. When Strange Days was released, critics were divided. Some praised the experimentation, the darker themes, and the sophisticated production. Others found the album too strange, too grim, or too self-indulgent. Commercially, it didn't match the impact of the debut. It peaked at number 3 on the Billboard 200 and didn't produce a hit as big as "Light My Fire." But Jim Morrison later said he liked Strange Days, precisely because it wasn't designed to please everyone. It was the Doors pushing deeper into their artistic instincts, not chasing radio play. Some reviewers complained that the album felt claustrophobic or unsettling, but those criticisms were, ironically, evidence that the band had achieved exactly what they intended. The cultural climate of late 1967 was also shifting. The innocence associated with the summer of love was already fading, and the Vietnam War, urban unrest, and political tension were filtering into the nation's collective psyche. In many ways, Strange Days reflected that fracturing more accurately than most records of its era. It wasn't colorful or celebratory. It was a mirror of the strange undercurrents running beneath American life. Over the decades, Strange Days has been reevaluated. Many historians now consider it one of the earliest examples of psychedelic rock, embracing avant-garde production techniques. Sunset Sound's 8-track machine, tape effects, the harpsichord, and atmospheric layering put the album years ahead of most rock recordings in 1967. Ray Manzarek once said the album captured the feeling of the times, the paranoia, the beauty, the weirdness, and that no other Doors record sounded quite like it. Modern critics have highlighted how the album's eerie tone predicted the darker, more introspective shifts that would soon dominate late 60s and early 70s rock. Its willingness to blur the line between poetry, theater, and music now feels prophetic rather than indulgent, and many contemporary musicians cite its production innovations as an influence. What was once seen as too experimental is now viewed as visionary. Today, Strange Days stands as a snapshot of a band hitting its artistic peak early. It shows all four members performing at their sharpest, not yet weighed down by the conflict, fame, and chaos that would hit them a year later. It captures Jim Morrison at the height of his creative confidence, writing lyrics that were poetic, disturbing, and strangely prophetic. It's the sound of the Doors, before the fame became too heavy, before the arrests, before the turmoil, and before Jim Morrison began his slow drift into myth. Strange Days is not just a sophomore album. It's a document of a band who saw the world changing faster than anyone expected and decided to soundtrack the uneasiness that came with it. Listening today, the album feels less like a product of 1967 and more like a timeless portrait of disorientation, a reminder that the strange days Morrison sang about never fully ended.